Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in this video I will show you how to figure out on your own whether this fact or this topic or this subject even is high yield or not, because not every USMLE form has the same distribution of subjects and topics. My test may be renal heavy, yours may be heavy on cardio or neuro but leaves out renal. So instead of telling you that, oh, renal is high yield, you should only focus on that, or cardio is high yield, I want to teach you how you can figure out on your own what really is high yield. And there's so many clues to this, I'm gonna touch on them later. At the end of the video, I will give you a list of high yield topics that came on my test and the low yield topics that didn't show up on my test, but they're not necessarily low yield, but they just didn't show up on my test. And in another video, I will add on what I said in this video and break down the list of high yield topics even more with each subject and system, as some of you have requested. Alright guys, so there is something that not everyone knows about, but I want you to go into the mind of the examiner. There is something called USMLE content outline that the NBME organization releases to examiners. So actually examiners use this document in order to make the test, okay, in order to know the scope of topics that they are going to base the test upon, so that the USMLE can make sure that all tests are fair. So they try as much as they can to make a fair distribution of topics, and they actually stick to this document with the topics in there. And it's actually based on this document that board materials were created. First aid was created based on this, as well as UWorld. I'm not saying that they created it like based on this alone, but I'm saying that they go back to this for scope. Now, because this content outline essentially is the scope of what you should know for the USMLE. It might be a very common problem that a lot of students might actually suffer, like they don't know how much I should learn, right? But it's outlined here in this document, guys. I only discovered this I only opened this document about 2 days out. But I figured out that I've actually covered much of the content outlined there, so I'm just going to show you a sample. This document is arranged the same way as first aid is arranged: general principles, then like cardio systems, cardio, renal, respiratory, and everything. And they lay out, as you can see here in front of you, each single topic and subtopic under each system and under each subject. So for cardio, for example, normal processes, this is what you should know. This should be used as a checklist. I actually used it as a checklist after I finished my entire dedicated period. 2 days out, I wanted to know whether I've really fulfilled everything I should know or not. So I check. Usually most of these information is found in first aid and is covered in board material, because board material always wanna cover as much as they can of what's coming in the test. So embryonic development, fetal maturation, this is what you should know for cardio. This is what you should know. You should know the chambers and valves regarding anatomy, the cardiac cycle, heart sounds, almost everything in medicine really. Cell and tissue structure, heart muscle metabolism. And so this in essence is so that you don't whine and complain later on after coming out of the test and saying, oh, this is not in first aid, oh, I didn't find this in UWorld, because what's found in here doesn't necessarily have to be covered in all the board material, but it's there. So if it's there, then the examiner has the right to put this into your test, right? So, use this as a checklist after you've already covered the material. Mostly you will find that you know all of this already, so don't stress yourself. This is just something I wanted you to know about. so that if something is in here that comes up on NBMEs, for example, and you say, oh my god, I didn't find this anywhere in your world, you know where these people get their stuff from, you know. So here is an example for respiratory, for example, organ structure and function, cell tissue, even, you know, even the pulmonary defense mechanisms and normal flora. No one asks about that nor even mentions it in first aid or your world. But if you get a question on that in the exam, people usually call these questions the WTF questions because no one ever heard about it, but the examiner has the right to put a question on these because it's found here. So this is not the way to find out something is high yield. This is just something I wanted to tell you at the beginning before we dive in, but the clues to whether something's high yield are gonna come next. So the first way to figure out whether the whole subject or system is high yield is to look at the number of questions allocated to them, to the subject in your world. Now I brought a screenshot because I obviously don't have access to your world anymore, but if you actually notice right off the bat, actually right as I started like fresh beginner, when I just subscribed to my UWorld, I looked at the number of questions and like I inferred right away that this correlates to how important a topic is, and it turned out it's true actually. So I found out that cardiovascular had the most number of questions allocated, like 316, and this is even a used QBank, so it might have been even more, like 400, 500, something like that. And followed by nervous system, 277, and then let's say pulmonary, gastrointestinal, hematology, and oncology. And in fact, this corresponds and correlates very well with how high yield these topics are. So this is the first clue to what subject you should start with. As I mentioned in my other video on your study schedule, that you should start with the highest yield. Why should you do that? Because obviously, if you choose a subject, if you choose to study a subject or a system that makes up a big weight of the test, makes up like 50% of the test, say like pathology, then you can at least guarantee that you will pass because, of course, you covered a subject for like that holds up a great weight, and so you will be able to answer as much as or as many as half the test, you know. So this is the only logical way to approach dedicated periods. So to start with the high yield, with what makes up most of the test, and don't, for example, focus on a subject where only one question comes and it might not come at all and leave out the important. This is just self-explanatory, I guess. So that's the first way to figure out. The second way to figure out is to use the UWorld search bar. Now, using the number of allocated UWorld questions will only tell you whether an entire system is high yield or an entire subject is high yield. But if you want to go by subtopic, let's say ovarian tumors, and you want to find out if this is high yield. Now this goes under reproductive, right? So reproductive might have like 150 questions, but I want to know exactly within the reproductive system what is high yield in reproductive, you know? So I'm gonna look up ovarian tumors. How much weight does it hold in with regard to questions in the reproductive system? So type in the UWorld search bar ovarian tumors and look up how many questions come up to you. So if, for example, out of the 150 questions on reproductive, 50 are on ovarian tumors, that's a pretty big weight, right? So you might want to focus your attention more on this subject, right? So that's another way to figure out. So I'm narrowing it down to you guys. You first start by subject or system through the number of allocated questions, and then you go down into the UWorld search bar to find out whether a subtopic within a system really is high yield. And then If PATHOMA mentions it, guys, then it's high yield. PATHOMA is so concise. It's like a very thin book. And so if such a sheer amount of information was put in such a small, concise book, that means that Dr. Sattar has only chosen the most high yield or must knows that you can't go into the test without knowing. So obviously this book should be known wholly, all right? So yeah, if PATHOMA mentions it, then it's high yield. This is probably the only book that I suggest that you know it by heart through the Duke PATHOMA deck. This is the only deck that I made sure to finish completely before the test. So I didn't finish the SOS deck, but I finished the Duke PATHOMA deck, because something as concise as that, it can't be smaller than that. This book can't be smaller than that for pathology. That makes up a great portion of the test. So please, whatever Dr. Sattar just focuses on or stresses on or says, oh, this is high yield, or says, oh, this is how they're going to ask you about that, then this is really how they're going to ask you about that. I got a question that is, oh my God, exact verbatim. It was creepy. So yeah, guys. All right. Another way by which you can know whether something is high yield is if NBME is tested frequently. Of course, those who write the NBMEs are those who write the test. So obviously, it will be a little bit of there will be some representation of the topics. So it's not tested in the same way, as in, actually, NBME questions and their description, like how the question is laid out, is not the same as the real deal. But the topic that is tested is the same. So the topics that NBMEs focus on are the topics that the real deal focuses on, regardless of how the question comes, So what you do with these NBMEs is not to stress on the score or anything. What you do with these NBMEs is to find out what topics they test and go ahead and hammer them from other sources. So a kind person called, I don't know, Plangum, yeah, that's his or her Reddit username, put out this post of the 100 questions that appear on every NBME. So if they appear on every NBME, then they must appear on the real deal, because they're tested so frequently by the examiners that put the test, right? So in biochemistry, for example, there is all these stuff laid out, and I highlighted from these the ones that actually came up on my test out of those. So I didn't get a lot on the inheritance mode or even down or PATHOMA or these stuff, but I got questions on vitamin deficiencies. This is something that you can't go into the test without knowing. And there is an app like Sketchy. There's like prep material like Sketchy called Pixorize, but for biochem. This is a good way to memorize vitamins. And gluconeogenesis or HMP shunt, this one is very high yield, and I got questions on glycogen storage diseases as well. Okay, so don't forget these. I didn't get a lot on lysosomes or anything. For immunology, guys, this is so high yield. Like, my entire test was immunology, and I was so thankful because that was my strong area. So thank God. So for immunology and microbiology, my test was not heavy microbiology at all, but I'm gonna tell you guys that STDs are always high yield regardless. I'm sure any test has STDs. And out of all these, I didn't get a lot of questions, but I guess hypersensitivity, I guess I got a question on that. And let's see, guys, primary immunodeficiencies, the inherited ones, the primary immunodeficiencies are just so high. Like, one block had like 3 or 4 questions of primary immunodeficiency. It was weird. And HIV for sure. Everything about HIV is high yield because of how distressing it is and how common it and increasing in prevalence it is. What else? Farm, not really, didn't focus much. I didn't even get questions on the CYP450 inhibitors or inducers. You know this, when I wrote as the on my scratch paper before I went into the test, like before I started the test, I wrote all the CYP450 inhibitors and inducers, and I didn't use this list at all. So yeah, cardio is always high yield, guys. It's always high yield, particularly shock. Okay, know all their types, and I have a video on that. And I got one question about a murmur, but guys, S4, S3, all these stuff, they wouldn't necessarily come in the form of a murmur that you gotta hear, even though they can come as such, but they will be described, like a gallop, for example, was heard. So you need to know that a gallop is an S4. And post-ventricular MI complications and their timeline is very important. You can't go into the test without that. So if you look at what these concentrate on, you will find that these are topics that are important in real life. So cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death. So why not get more questions on that, right? But that's not always the rule. Their questions don't always make sense. So for example, primary immunodeficiencies are really not that common, but they still ask about it. So yeah. Now endocrine, guys, and immunology was the bulk of my test. Endocrine, oh my god, particularly thyroid stuff, and the ones that relate to electrolytes. When there is anything that mixes a system with another, it's always high yield. So endocrine, when it mixes with, calcium, and when it mixes with, like in the parathyroid, or when it mixes with the electrolyte disturbances that occur with Addison's, if there is a combination of two systems together, renal electrolytes with endocrine, then this subject is high yield, and this is when understanding comes, and this is when Anki can fail you actually if you don't really hammer the topic A to Z and know everything behind it and the bits and pieces, like understand the concept itself, because these questions come in the form of up and down arrows, and you really need to master the concept really well with these especially, and they're focusing attention much on this lately to filter out those students who really understand the topic by heart and those who just memorized facts. The examiners are steering away from asking questions that just depend on recall of factoids. Now GI, I didn't get a lot of GI on my test at all. I actually don't remember what I got in GI, but I did get ovarian tumors picture or something. So yeah, guys, focus on the histopathological pictures with reproductive, reproductive pathologies in general, of the female reproductive in particular, and also, let's see, yeah, hemonc. Just focus on the entire hemonc, guys. Whether it's white blood cells, red blood cells, or platelets, it's always high yield. And thankfully, thank God, I reviewed this chapter. It's chapter 4 in PATHOMA. Review this, guys. I reviewed it the night of the test. Okay? Chapter 4 of PATHOMA. There is so many stuff in there, and they're tested. All of them are tested, and the questions were straightforward. In other words, if you know it, you know it, MSK, review the MSK chapter in first aid. This is probably the only chapter I will tell you to read from first aid, or read frequently, because everything there, the The anatomy there is essentially the anatomy that you should know for the test. It's simple as that, okay? And for neuro, okay, the strokes are very high yield. Which side? Particularly brain stem stuff. So they will always show you as well a brain anatomy picture. Well, for example, a spinal cord section and a case of someone who got, for example, a stroke, and then they will show you, they will want you to point at which side and which tract in the spinal cord section or in a brain section, okay? So correlating brain anatomy with strokes is very important, and the side, very important as well. It's always, like most of the time, it's contralateral. All right. Okay, so stroke regions, very important, number 8. Now, regarding psychiatry, I really only got like one psychiatry questions, guys, and it was about depression, I think. So not so high yield on my test. Just a disclaimer, I'm talking, guys, based on my experience. Your test may be different, I don't know, okay? For renal, just know the entire renal, guys. Just know the entire renal, particularly when it correlates with electrolytes. Repro, all repro is high yield, regardless. All repro. Not really disorders of sexual development. Didn't get a lot on that, even though I have a video on that. But repro concerning female tumors, like of the female reproductive system, and also the male genital system nerves related to erection and these stuff, and how, for example, actually this came up on so many NBMEs, how prostatic surgery affects the nerves of erection, like pudendal nerve, I guess. So yeah, you really need to know that, and the function of these nerves. It's not mentioned a lot in board material, to be honest. For example, first aid wouldn't tell you the function of this nerve or how it would be affected with surgery in the prostate. So I think you should learn it just from another resource. Respiratory for sure, acid-base balance for sure, AA gradient, okay. I don't think it came on my test, but it is important. Okay, so this is based on my test, guys, and embryology of the respiratory tract is also important. Okay, now another way by which you can figure out if something is high yield is if it's found in the first aid rapid review section. Now this is the narrowest I can go. That's not even subtopic, it's like concepts. I narrowed it by concepts. So first I gave you how you can figure out if an entire subject or system is high yield, and then how you can figure out a subtopic in this or a topic inside this system, like ovarian tumors within reproductive, and then subtopics in the NBME list. And now it is words, really, conditions. Okay, so hypertension, secondary hypertension associated with such and such. So these are must-knows. If they're found in the rapid review section, which is actually a short section, then you can't go in the test without knowing them, okay? So it means that anyone who should get an average score knows all these stuff, right? So use that as a checklist as well to review in your, like maybe a day out. I reviewed it actually in the night of the test, and I found out I knew everything about that. It's just correlations and stuff. But this is the basic knowledge, you know. If it's in the rapid review section, the rapid review has such a high threshold for knowing information, meaning that it only has a little bit, okay? But it has only the ones that are must-knows and that no one with an average score wouldn't know about, you know. Finally, guys, I will tell you what is high yield based on my test and what is low yield based on my test as well, so you can prioritize your studying. First off, immunology, like I told you, I always stressed whether primary immunodeficiencies or the thymus and maturation, or HIV stuff, or hypersensitivity, or organ rejection, I guess, transplant rejection. All these stuff are high yield. Even the drugs, pharmacology drugs for immunology. I'm not sure if a question came on that, but yeah. Endocrine, like I said, endocrine as it correlates with renal electrolytes, parathyroidism, hyperparathyroidism, and calcium, all these stuff. Repro, I told you, female reproductive, ovarian tumors and stuff, alongside the pictures. The picture is very important, cervical tumors, and male genital system nerves. Male genital system nerves, guys, I wasn't strong in this. I actually didn't know a lot about it at all, but I'm not sure if I actually got that question right. But guys, just know it, okay? The nerves of erection and how prostatic cancer affects it, which nerves are actually injured in each type of prostatic of surgery to remove a prostatic tumor. So make sure you know that from another source other than board material, because it's simply not mentioned in board material. Hemonc, like I told you, review chapter 4 of PATHOMA. Everything hemonc is high yield. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. I can't stress that enough. Biostats and epidemiology. What exactly came on biostats? I actually never used the calculator on my test. Why? Because there was no calculation question. Rather, the questions were focusing more on study bias. And I actually have a request for a video on study bias. So yeah, guys, study bias, oh my god, it was like the entire test, like whenever a question came in biostats or epidemiology, it will ask about study bias for some reason. And I was horrible in that. But yeah, it is what it is. You should do study bias, right? And also, there was this, the sensitivity specificity questions didn't come in the typical way. They didn't come like calculations, because that would have been easy because everyone knows it. Rather, they came as the validity of the test. There is this AUC curve, I guess. Now, PATHOMA chapters 1 to 3. I'm not the first one to tell you about these. I actually knew that from Reddit and from everyone else who took the test, and stressed that these give you freebies. Like, it's a waste if you don't review that before your test. Embryology. I was surprised that embryology on my test was actually more high yield than anatomy, okay? Now, based on my test, what was low yield? That doesn't mean it's low yield entirely, guys. It's low yield based on my test, got it? So don't quote me on that. Psychiatry, like I said, I only got like one psychiatry question. It was so easy. It was depression, typical. It was a freebie, actually. So even though I was so stressed out with psychiatry, thank God, like with the timeline and stuff, I only got one question. Micro, only got one question, was so easy. You can easily figure it out from one video of sketchy. So yeah, don't stress yourself much about that and trying to learn the bacteria that are outside of your world and outside of first aid. I was so stressing out about that because I didn't know these other bacteria, but thank God I only got like one question as well. Gastro, like GI, didn't get a lot on that. Anatomy, I got like 2 questions. I can't disregard anatomy completely and say that it's the most low yield. No, it's not the most low yield. I actually got more questions on anatomy than I got on psychiatry. But I will tell you that the MSK chapter of first aid is very important for this one. This is probably the most useful chapter in first aid. And the 100 concepts Anki deck of Dorian, very useful as well for that. Genetics finally didn't come up on a lot on my test. There is a continuum to this video, guys, where I break down everything even more by subtopic, but I'm gonna leave it for another video, and I hope you like this one.